Welcome back. My name is Quinten Krzysko. I am joined by Steve Letizia. We are here to talk about defensive tackles as we are building the draft board for the Chicago Bears. I am excited about tonight. This might be the deepest position group in the draft. I mean, we're talking, I think right now we have, I think 13 starting grades on guys. And when we say that, I mean, that's like eventual starter. But first of all, I'm joined by Steve. How are you doing tonight, Steve?
Doing good. Draft is fast approaching. I feel like I'm simultaneously watching tape every single day, but also completely unprepared for the draft, which is in like a month and a half. But it's good. And D tackle, like you said, is the deepest, easily the deepest position because I was kind of ranking my guys, and like I have a guy who's 12th overall. I'm like, man, I really like that guy. So this is a fun position to talk about. I'm really excited.
Yeah, so we always want to start these shows. If you're a regular listener, you know this already, but with what the Bears have at this position group that we're talking
Mhm.
about already. So, Steve, when we're looking at the Bears defensive tackle room, and I'm pulling it up here as we go,
Mhm.
but I mean, really, we're talking about Gervon Dexter, talking about Andrew Billings, and then you got Zacch Pickens and Chris Williams from last year, and also Jonathan Ford who played 77 snaps. Steve, how
Yeah.
are you feeling about that group right now?
Honestly, not too great to be honest. I mean, Gervon Dexter, I really love. I mean, I think he's going to be took a next step into his sophomore year. I think he's going to take a next step into next year. So he's a kind of foundational piece. Billings, obviously, you love Billings, but you got the injuries now. What was it, a torn pec, I believe he had. So and he's on the wrong side of 30. So I think he'll be back and he'll be the starter. But you got to be prepared for him to maybe not be his normal self. And then after that, no one. I mean, Zacch Pickens is a body. The other guy, Jonathan Ford, mentioned is less than a body. So I mean, they need to add to this position for sure in free agency and the draft. So uh, and it's a position we saw with the Eagles. You can't just have two guys. You don't have a starting one tech and a starting three tech. You need four guys that you feel confident about playing a majority of your snaps, minimum four guys. So there's a lot to work, a lot of room to grow on this defensive tackle position for the Bears.
Yeah, now, I mean, as you're saying, like with Billings, I do think I'm probably a bit more optimistic on his outlook because, like, I just don't think a peck matters that much for the way he plays.
Yeah,
He's shorter arms. He just wins with leverage and pure brute strength. Like, it's not like he's like when Akeem Hicks had the upper body injury. I felt like that really impacted his game because so much of his game was based on getting his paws on someone and being able
yeah,
to chuck him out of his way. With Billings, it's much more like he's just the length and the upper body power aren't really how he wins. So I'm like,
yeah.
I think he should be able to come back fine. But like you said, over 30, it's going to start deteriorating sooner than later.
And
And
he and
go ahead.
well, I was just gonna say this. I mean, I agree with you. His game is built off lower body power more than upper body for sure. But also, he plays a very physical position, like that nose tackle position. He's not the biggest nose tackle, like for a guy who's pretty good at being a nose tackle. So like that physicality, like he's gonna start wearing down soon. I think he'll be fine for this year, but I think you got to start looking for his replacement this offseason as well, even if you're not looking to replace his starting spot.
Yeah. And so when we're talking, I mean, I think Gervon Dexter, like, you're good with him being your starter. I mean, it
Hmm.
would be great if he could be your DT3, but like,
Sure.
you're gonna have a hard time finding someone that's gonna replace it. Like, even if you go sign like a Milton Williams, I still don't know that he's necessarily starting over Dexter. Like, in my mind at least. I haven't gone and dug into
Yeah.
Milton Williams tape, but
Yeah. I think you get creative if they do go that route and say Mel Williams, let's say, I think you would get creative to try and get all three of those guys on the field at the same time a good amount, because I
right.
think all three of them are pretty good players. So, but yeah, they definitely need to add to the group.
And Steve, how did you feel about Zacch Pickens 2 years ago when they drafted him?
I ashamed to say that I liked the Zach Pickens pick, so I
Hey,
might have
you're
been
not
wrong
alone.
about
I
that.
did too.
I
So
thought he his tape at South Carolina was pretty good, and when they got him, like was it 64? Like I thought that was maybe a slight reach, but not anything crazy. I had him kind of ranked right around there. I thought his tape was really good. His tape at the Senior Bowl was really good too, a few years
mhm.
ago. So I'm surprised that he hasn't at least turned into like a serviceable player, and maybe he still can. It hasn't been that. It's not like he's going into his third year, right? So there's
Yeah.
a chance for him to like turn into at least a serviceable player. But I think they kind of he's a victim of kind of misuse. I never really saw him as a nose tackle. I saw him more as like a five. Really, I saw him more as like a five technique, which the Bears don't really utilize. But
Yeah.
what I saw him coming into the league, and when the Bears drafted him, like, okay, he's probably going to play three then, mostly three technique then. And I know the Bears like to, their three and one techniques are pretty interchangeable, but he was mostly playing the nose, which I didn't really like that for his role.
Yeah, it was almost more like role than alignment. Like,
Yeah,
because even there were times where he was at three tech, but you could see he wasn't his job wasn't to fire off the ball through the lane. It was like
right.
his job was to eat up space and try and play numbers games in that front.
Yeah.
And I don't know, like a part of me says that Zacch Pickens is one of my biggest lessons
Hmm.
at judging defensive tackle, because I had him, I think, at like 68 or something around there on my board. They took him at 64. I was like, okay, the value works.
Yeah.
But his tape at South Carolina to me was like, if this guy could just let it loose, he
Hmm.
would be so good.
Yeah.
And I feel like the entire time he's been in the NFL, I'm like, why hasn't he let it loose yet? So it's like that inherent violence at the position is something that I've adjusted my scouting to, being like,
Mm.
you either have that or you don't, I think is where I'm saying. That's why I brought him up, because I
Yeah.
think that is for me, it's a big learning spot when I'm talking about Zacch Pickens.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, when we're talking about Dennis Allen defense, Steve, we are
Hmm.
talking about, let's see here. We are talking about players like Christian Boyd, Brian Brzee, Jordan Jackson, who barely even played in the league, a Sheldon Rankins, David Onyemata, and a Tyler Davison. What, when I say those names, like, what is there any archetype that comes to your mind for what they are, or is it just kind of a grab bag? Does it feel like?
I feel like that's kind of a grab bag. I mean, I'm just like the guys I know the most of are probably Percy and Rankins. Sheldon Rankins is more of like more shorter, kind of bowling ball kind of player than
Mm-hmm.
Brian Percy is more of a longer, taller guy. So I don't know. I'm not gonna pretend to be a Dennis Allen defensive expert. That's for sure. But it seems to me that that group of players you just named is it doesn't. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you see one, but I don't see like a one thing that like all those guys possess that we're gonna be looking for.
No, I don't either. I mean, Christian Boyd and Sheldon Rankins probably have some similarities.
Yeah.
I mean, Anyamata and Brzee might have some, but like basically, when I've seen these names that the Saints picked when Dennis Allen was D coordinator or higher there, like it's just kind of, it seems like they're just going for talent and they're going to make it work however they can make it work.
Which I think is the best way to do it. As soon as I mean, you just get good football players, which I think the Bears sometimes trying too much to get to kind of they outsmart themselves. Like,
Hmm.
let's get this guy because he can do this one specific thing. It's like, no, just get the good guy who can go do a bunch of different things because the scheme you're running now might not be the scheme you're running
Yeah.
next year and stuff like that. So just get good football players.
I mean, one thing that stands out to me, and I know as I've watched, as I've started doing draft coverage and all this, I start watching guys around the league more
Hmm.
to see to get those post evals. Like, oh, I had this grade on Brian Brzee. I wonder how he's doing. So I'll
Yeah.
go watch a little Brian Brzee tape and see that, oh, the Saints have, like, they just run stunts like crazy now because Brian Brzee is good on stunts, and that's
Yeah.
like, okay, that's what they do now on defense.
Hmm.
So I think there's some of that with Dennis Allen, is kind of evolving what works for his guys who can be difference makers.
Yeah.
Brzee's been only okay in the league, but like
Yeah.
Dennis Allen with the Saints clearly tried to do everything to make sure that he played well.
Hmm.
Now, when we're talking draft, Steve, how much draft capital do you see the Bears spending at the defensive tackle position this year?
I mean, they could draft one at 10, and that would not be crazy. I mean, they could spend a first round pick, they could spend a second round pick, they could spend two picks, even on the defensive tackle position. One because it's a need, and they need probably multiple guys, and two, it's just such a deep defensive tackle class. I almost want them to spend two picks on the guys. Maybe get a guy with one of your first three picks, and then another guy, maybe early on day three if you pick up like a fourth rounder in a trade or something like that. Um, I think that makes all the sense in the world. It's a position that you, like I said earlier, you need 4 guys minimum to be that you can kind of rely on. You want to have that strong defensive line rotation to keep guys fresh and everything like that. So I don't think there's. I mean, maybe if you drafted 3 guys, maybe that's too many. But I really don't see a scenario where after the draft, I'm like, man, they or even after draft and free agency, and I say to myself, well, they focus too much on D tackle. I don't think that's that. I don't see myself saying that. So I mean, if Mason, we'll get into all the players, but if Mason Graham's there at 10, they could easily make that decision to take him.
Yeah. Now, do you think there's a because like if we're gonna assume that Zacch Pickens makes this roster,
Mm-hmm.
you got 3 guys there already, and then Chris Williams is probably like they'd like I'm sure Ryan Poles would like to keep Chris Williams if it makes sense to, but like I don't think
Yeah,
he's preventing them from drafting a guy.
I would say the same thing with Zacch Pickens. I don't think they're that you would if he makes the team great, but I don't think he's changing any of their plans.
Okay, so you think if they draft 2 defensive tackles, it's probably like they have no issue carrying 5 and letting Chris Williams go, or if they somehow draft 3, you think that or sign a guy in draft 2, Zacch Pickens is like a non-factor.
I think at this point you have to consider him a non-factor and then just hope that you run into that issue and be like, oh shoot, Zacch Pickens has looked really good in training camp and preseason. We're in a tough spot. We got to make a tough cut. Maybe we'll keep 5 defensive tackles and cut elsewhere. I don't think you can expect that to happen. It just would be a nice surprise if it
Right.
did. So I think you worry about get good football players, get a bunch of guys who can affect both the run and pass game, and then worry about the numbers later on. I don't see them drafting like 3 guys, so I think
Yeah.
you maybe you get 1 guy in the draft, 1 guy in free agency, or 2 guys in the draft, whatever it may be. And then maybe a lesser guy in free agency, and then you kind of just work out that out later on. But I don't see that many. I don't see a problem with carrying 5 defensive tackles.
Yeah. And if I'm being honest with it, if you're sitting there in the late rounds and there's a defensive tackle they like who might be a lighter body
Yeah,
guy, like we know how much Dennis Allen likes heavy defensive ends. You can get creative with some of that too. I think if
yeah,
you wanted to sign a guy and draft 2 defensive tackles, but one's in
yeah,
the 5th round, you're sitting there
yeah,
going like, well, this guy has fallen this far and he's a dude, like he's a dog. So let's get him. Like
yeah. I
I'm
mean,
all for that.
like I said, when with like if they do sign Milton Williams and they have Gervon Dexter and Milton Williams and Andrew Billings, like I don't think they'd have any problem playing Gervon Dexter on the edge on early downs. So
Yeah.
there's definitely things they can do to kind of work around the defensive line rotation.
Which, speaking of which, I am curious to see what Gervon Dexter's body looks like coming into this year because
Yeah.
he cut so much weight last year. It was good at 3 tech, but then when Billings went down, it's like this guy can't survive at 1 tech anymore.
Yeah.
Like he
Right.
used to have the mass to at least look like he could survive. Like now he
Mhm.
just doesn't.
Yeah, it'll be interesting for sure.